Maya is a massive program. There are so many things that you can do with it that it can be easy to get overwhelmed. Fortunately, though, when it comes to animating in Maya, there's actually not that much that you really need to know. In just this one video, I'm going to show you everything that you need to know in order to get started animating in Maya. To give you a bit of context on my relationship with Maya, I've worked as a feature animator for many years using Maya on the job. When I first started working in animation, though, I worked exclusively in 2D animation and I knew very little about 3D animation software. But since I had already graduated from school, it was basically on me to learn how to use Maya, and the way that I did that was mostly by watching YouTube tutorials, much like the one that I'm making right now. So let's get started. Alright, so when you first open up Maya, chances are it's going to look something like this, and there's a lot to take in here. You have options for things like modeling, rigging, lighting, rendering, animating, texturing, effects, motion graphics, and even more. And that's a lot of stuff, but fortunately, you can ignore most of it. Well, except for the animating part, you'll need to know that. The point I'm getting at, though, is that you can use Maya to do pretty much all of the jobs needed in order to make a 3D film, but if you're looking at it from the perspective of someone who's just working as an animator, you only need to know the parts of it that you're going to use to actually make the characters move. When you're in a studio environment, there are going to be specific departments for all of these different features, but for the animator, your job is just to make the character move. I've worked at studios like Illumination and Disney alongside other animators who actually have very limited knowledge in regards to working in Maya, but they're great animators and they know just enough about Maya in order to be able to animate in it. And obviously, having more knowledge about the software can definitely be helpful, but what I'm getting at is that it's not a necessity in order to be able to animate. So first off, I'm going to go over the different areas of the UI that you can see here. Up top here, you've got a bunch of drop-down menus, much like you'll see in basically any software, things like, file, edit, properties, windows, things like that. And when you're animating, you usually don't need to know what's inside of most of these, except for mainly probably like file, edit. You'll go to windows sometimes. You might want to create something, and then you'll need your constrain tools here. You can use more of these when you get into advanced animation, but for just basic animation in Maya, you typically don't need them. One thing I'm going to point out that's pretty important is this other drop-down menu right here, which says animation currently. There are different choices in here. You can see modeling, rigging, animation, effects, rendering, and customize. When you change this, you can see that it changes the different menus up top here. So as you can see, there is a lot of stuff you can do in Maya, so much that it's separated into different sections here. So if you're looking for a particular menu and you don't see it here, chances are you just have the wrong setting in this drop-down menu. You've got a whole bunch of buttons here. You don't need to worry about most of them. Ones like this, they're just normal functions like save, undo, redo, that kind of stuff. You have two buttons here, select by object type and select by component type. When animating, you'll want to always have select by object type on. If you accidentally click one of these, you'll see that it changes your menu here. So if you see this menu, you just need to select by object type with this button here to get this menu back. And this menu, it allows the type of things which you are able to select. Usually when I'm animating, I turn off pretty much everything except for these two, because I just want to really be able to select the curve objects here, so basically just the controllers and things like that. It's not a big deal though. The rest of this stuff I mostly just ignore. Up here you could change the workspace settings if you'd like to. Over here you can see your shelves. There's a bunch of different ones for things like animation, rigging, rendering, things like that. Once again, if you don't see a button that you're looking for here, just make sure that you're actually on the right shelf. You can also create custom buttons. I've got a few of them here. Most of these ones I just ignore, except for maybe this one. Sometimes I'll use the motion trail setting. On the left here, you've got your tools. So you've got, move, rotate, scale, things like that. Usually people will just flip through these by using the hotkeys. I think it's Q, W, E, and R. We'll flip through these pretty quickly when animating. Down here, this is kind of important. This sets up the way you see a workspace here. So for example, right now we have one window here with the character in it. I could select this one, and now we have 4 different windows in it. So a lot of the time when you're animating, you want to see the character from different views at the same time. So this can be very useful. You can choose which views are going to appear here. There's this other one here, which has 2 different views. You can also make custom setups and save them. So if you go over here and you right click, you can save your current layout and edit layouts and things like that. Right now, we're just going to leave it set to the default, just one window here. Right here is your outliner window, which is pretty important as well. A lot of people will have this open when they're working, or at least off to the side somewhere. But in your outline, basically the outliner shows everything which is in your file. If there's something that exists, you can find it in the outliner. There isn't very much in this file right now. There's just the rig, so I could expand this rig and go into the specific parts of it, like the controls and the mesh and things like that, or I could just search for something. But when you're in an actual scene in production, there's going to be a lot of stuff, not just a character. You'll have environments and lots of different things, so you can search for it in here. And there is a pretty important hotkey also. So say I have something selected, we'll just grab this head control. If I'm in my outliner and I press F, the F hotkey, it's going to bring me to what I have selected. So there's the head control right there. There is more to the outliner, but that's basically what it's for, is finding stuff in the scene. After recording this video, I remembered something I should have mentioned that is very important, so I'm going to add this section here. So in this outliner, you can see we have this character rig named Akali Rig. There is a character in this scene. When you first open up Maya, there will not be a character in your scene. This will be just empty. The way that you would add a character to your scene is to reference it in. So you would go File, Create Reference, and then you would navigate to the file in which your character rig exists, and you would create a reference for that. You can see if I open up my reference editor, it shows me what I have referenced into the scene, which is this Akali base rig here. This is a rig which I got from the Agora website. It's a character from League of Legends. It's free to download. I'll put a link to that in the video description below. And the reason it's important to create a reference is because you could actually just open up the Maya file in which your character rig exists. You could just open up the rig file and start animating in that. But then if you make changes to the rig or adjustments in that file, you're kind of stuck with those changes. However, if you create a reference, you're not actually changing the rig, you're just changing your reference of the rig. Your rig itself still lives in its own separate file. So it's basically like a safeguard to make sure that you don't break stuff. Up at the top of this window here, there are a few things that can be pretty important with this one. You hear view, shading, lighting, show, renderer, and panels. Panels in particular, because this is the one which is going to allow you to choose what you're going to see in this this panel here. So right now it is set to perspective, and what perspective view means is that I can just freely navigate around and do this kind of thing. You'll see this little box here rotating also. I believe that's called the view cube, I think, but that shows you which view you're, kind of looking at it from. But say I wanted to switch this from a perspective view to something else, I would go panel. Maybe I want one of the orthographic views. I could choose, say, left. And now I am looking at it from the left view. I just need to zoom out in order to actually see what's going on here. I'm going to switch it back to perspective. And when I was zooming out, I realized one thing that's actually quite important that I should probably talk about is how I zoomed out like that. The hotkeys for navigating around. So if I hold the Alt key on the keyboard and I click with the left mouse button, I can rotate the camera around in perspective here. If I hold the Alt key and I click and hold the middle mouse button and drag, I can pan around like this. Also, if I'm holding the Alt key and I click the right mouse button, I can zoom like this. If I'm not holding the Alt key, when I press those mouse buttons, the left mouse button will give me this marquee here. The middle one seems to do nothing. I can scroll it. Without holding Alt, I can scroll it and it does this, it zooms. And the right one, this will just give me a couple options that I can choose here. But generally, if you want to navigate in perspective, you want to be holding Alt when you move your mouse around. One thing to be very aware of is that if you press the space bar, you're going to get this menu opening up, there's a lot of different things you can choose here. This is called the Hotbox. It's a way to basically switch between different things very quickly. So if I'm holding space, I could go to File or Edit or click any of these things. I actually don't really use this function very much, or at all really. I just haven't really found a need to use it when animating. You could use it for sure. But one thing to point out about this is that sometimes I will accidentally just tap the space bar and then be clicking around, and then I'll accidentally click on one of these things without realizing it. So then it'll be easy to get kind of lost for a second and be like, oh, what just happened? So if you want to kind of reset because you've accidentally clicked on something, you could just go to your layouts here and click on one of these to reset it. You'll have a custom one you can reset to, or if you even really need to, you can go up to your workspace and reset that up here. Speaking of up here, one thing I can point out also is that it's possible to drag and rearrange all of these panels that you see here. So say for example, I could drag this and move it around. I can dock it here. If you want to disable the option to drag things, which I usually do once I have my workspace set up, I don't want to accidentally drag something around. There's a button up here. You can click this lock to lock or unlock the docking option. I'm gonna temporarily just move my face over here while I talk about some of the things on the right side of the screen. So right now, the one that I've selected is the channel box, which is pretty important. So if I have a control selected, say the head once again, we can see some things here. This is the channel box, which shows the information for the various inputs for it, so the translate and the rotate values. So say if I were to move this head, I'll rotate it like this, you can see the rotation values changing. I do use the channel box when animating. Also, one thing that's kind of cool is you can isolate specific values here. So say I just want to change the rotate X, I could even just type in a value, say right now it's -23. What if I want it to be like +40? So then it rotates like that. You'll see the mouse will change to this different shape here when I just hold the mouse over this. When it's like this, if I just click and then hold the left mouse button and drag, you can see I can adjust the value that way too. That's a way that some people do prefer to work. It's kind of just preference. There's some additional information here which can be relevant, but specifically for animating, you usually don't need to pay attention to this so much when you're just making the character move. If you're getting into constraints and dealing with those, then you can find information about your constraints here, which could be useful. Another menu here which is quite important, however, not as much for specifically animation. It's very important for Maya in general, but in animation you don't have to go into here so much, but this is the attribute editor, which shows you the various attributes of whatever you have selected, and generally there tends to be a lot of attributes for basically anything in Maya, which you can adjust. So I found the attribute editor with all this information here can tend to be a bit overwhelming, but when it comes to specifically just animating the character, you usually don't really need to change much in the attribute editor, if at all, ever really. But if you're doing other functions in Maya, yeah, you'll definitely need to look at stuff in here. So I'll go back to the channel box. So on the bottom, on the right side here, this is where your layers are going to be. If you've worked in a software like Photoshop before, you're very familiar with layers. They work pretty similar in Maya. So you have two different types of layers. You have display layers and animation layers. Display layers are basically what they would sound like they do. They display objects. So say I put an object in a layer, there's one for the mesh of the character right here. I can turn that on or off with this button right here, this V. If I want to make a new layer, I can click this button right here with a little plus on it. The way that I would usually make a layer is if I have something selected, like say, I don't know, I grab all of these things. If I go into this menu here and click layers, create layer from selected, that's just going to create a layer that has everything that I had currently selected in it. There are also animation layers. This is getting into, talking about animation layers would be getting into more than just a beginner tutorial type of thing, but there are different workflows in which they're kind of necessary and other workflows in which you don't need them at all. But basically it is possible to make different layers of animation on the same control. For just basic animation, we don't need to deal with that though. One other piece of useful information could be, you see you have all these things selected here. If I want to deselect everything, I just click in some empty space and it just deselects it. That's with the left mouse button. Okay, now onto the bottom of the screen. This is a very important part. This is your timeline. You can scrub through it if you just click with the left mouse button and drag. Over to the right of it here, these are the playback controls. So if I wanted to play it, I would just click this. I could click again to stop it. This little box right here shows which frame you're currently on. Down below the timeline, this is actually a pretty important part as well in terms of managing how you work. This bar here and these numbers on either side of it allow you to adjust what you see in the timeline. So right now, you can see it says 1 to 125. That means that I'm viewing frame 1 to 125 on the timeline. If I want to grow the timeline though, I could just click and drag this out. Now I'm seeing 1 to 200. Say I want to see more than 200, I could expand that value by clicking on this 200 here. Say I want to see up to 300 frames, I'll just put in 300. And now the timeline didn't actually change, but this bar did. So this 200 here is showing what is currently visible in the timeline. However, the actual length of the timeline is 300 frames. We're just only looking at up to 200 frames of it. If I wanted, I could click and drag this bar, and now I'd be looking at frame 101 to 300 of the timeline, but the total length of the timeline is still 300 frames. So if I wanted to just expand to see the entire timeline, I would just click and drag all the way out here. I find myself adjusting this quite frequently. Usually if I want to zoom in on part of the timeline to see exactly how many frames are in between a specific part of animation, I would just shrink my timeline like this. You can get a really up close view and do some, some finer adjustments. And then when I want to see the animation more as a whole, I would just grow the selection like that. I think for the pieces of the UI here, that's mostly what you would need to know in order to be able to get started animating. There is one other piece of the UI which I want to show you, which is very important for animation, which we don't actually see right now, and that's going to be the graph editor. That is a huge part of Maya, the graph editor. First, I'm going to move my face back over here, though. Maybe right there. So if we want to open up the graph editor, one way to do it would be to go Windows, come down to Animation Editors, and choose Graph Editor, and that opens it up here. Right now it's kind of in the way though. I'll show you the way that I usually have my workspace set up. I'm just going to set it to 2 views right now. I'm going to collapse the outliner right there because we don't really need that open all the time. I want to enable docking. I'm going to grab my graph editor and put it right here. So everyone kind of has their own way of setting up Maya. A lot of people like to have the graph editor over on a separate monitor, but if you want to have everything on one monitor, this is how I tend to like having things set up. Make this a bit bigger here. I'll just disable docking again. The reason I want 2 views is because, let me switch this to perspective. It's because usually when you're animating, you will have a camera view which you will be animating to. But if you're working on a production, the camera view is going to be decided by someone else, but you need to be working to that camera view. So the reason I would have 2 views is because I want one of them to be perspective. I'm just going to set one of these to say, I don't know, like front. I'll zoom out a bit. But the reason you would want 2 is because you want one to be perspective, because you want to be able to move around and select things. And then the other one, you want to see how the character looks in your camera view. There are some people that might work with, say, 4 views open. They would have, perspective, probably camera, and maybe some orthographic views. You could do that as well. It's all very customizable and just up to personal preference. But back to the graph editor, though. Graph editor is very important. Basically, what it is a visual representation of how your character is animating, of how the information is changing as the timeline would play out. So you can see here, if I click and drag in the timeline and the graph editor also moves. There isn't really anything in here yet though, because there's no animation and I also have nothing selected. So let's actually put some information on to this character now. I'm not going to pose out the full character, but let's say, for example, I want to set a key on all of the controls at frame 1. One way to do that would be just left mouse click, marquee drag, select everything. And to set a key, the hotkey for that is S. So if I press S, you'll see a keyframe now appears here. You can also, in the graph editor, go right click and insert key. That would work too. But really everyone just presses S to set a keyframe. You can adjust your keyframes. If you wanted to say delete this, you could right click on it and go delete. Now the key is gone. But let's just say, for example, in my hypothetical scene, Set a key. This is how the character is supposed to look at the beginning of the scene. It's very interesting, right? If I wanted to then create another pose, I could go say, I don't know, maybe 20 frames later, something like that. I'm just going to shrink the timeline here. I really don't need it to be 300 frames right now. Let's put it to, I don't know, like say 50. If I then deselect what I have selected, you'll see the information here changed. Now it's not showing anything. That's because it only shows the keys and the information for what I currently have selected. So say I select the head again. If I want her to maybe look the other way, I could then left mouse click and drag this to have her look the other way. You'll notice that it automatically made a key as soon as I released the mouse. Maya doesn't necessarily do that by default. However, that's the way that I prefer to work, and that I've found that a lot of people do prefer to work, is with auto key set on. What that means is that whenever you move something, it will automatically key whatever you moved in your timeline. To adjust this setting, the way you would do that is there's a button down at the very bottom right hand corner right here. This is your auto key button. So if I turn that off, let's say I grab the root control here, if I am to shift that over and then let go, you'll see no new key was made. Since there's no key there, if I move the timeline at all, say I want to go back a frame, well, that information is gone now. However, with auto key on, if I do the same thing, I click and drag, it sets a key, so now I can move and it keeps that information there. This is something that happens a lot of the time if you end up losing your preferences in Maya, or you need to open up a new version of Maya or something, is that I believe usually by default auto key is set to off. And this has happened to me many times where I'll end up losing poses that I've made for a character because I'll pose out a character, spend some time doing it, and I'll be working as if I have auto key on because I usually do, so I just assume that it would be on. So, you know, I'll make my pose for a character, and then I'll want to move to a different keyframe or take a look at how it's animating. I'll shift the timeline, and then my pose disappears because it turns out auto key was not actually on, and all that information is now lost. So it's just one thing to keep in mind is if you want to work with auto key on, just make sure that it actually is on. Or if you're working with it off, make sure that once you've created a pose, you actually set a keyframe before you move your timeline, because once the timeline is moved, that information is gone if there's no key set. But we have some information to look at here now though. So you can see if I click and drag, if I scrub through the timeline, the character is moving because we have two keyframes to move between. The first frame, you might remember that I set a key on all of the controls. However, on this second keyframe at frame 20, I put information onto the root here, but say for example I grab the hand, there is no key there. There is on the head though, because that we put another pose on that, you'll remember it's moving. And then when I look at the graph editor here, when I have something with more than one key on it, you can see some information here. These are your curves. And as I was saying, this is a visual representation of how that whatever part of the character is, of how that's moving. And much like in the channel box here, you'll see there's information in the graph editor for things like translate X, Y, and Z or Z, and rotate X, Y, and Z or Z. I'm just going to say Z because I'm from Canada. You can actually adjust your animation in just the graph editor. Some people like to work a lot in the graph editor. I do work in it quite frequently. So say I wanted to adjust the way the head is moving in maybe the x-axis for just rotation, I could isolate that information by clicking on rotate x, and now I only see the rotate x information. If I grab this key here, I can then use the left mouse button to move it around, and you can see the character's head is moving around. Usually if I'm going to adjust a key in the graph editor, the way I'll do it is by holding the shift key and then moving the key. If I hold shift, that's going to lock the way that I'm moving the key into either adjusting the value for what I have selected if I move up and down, or if I press shift and then I move left or right, that will lock it into moving where the key is on the timeline. So say if I let go here, that key is now at frame 14. If I wanted to undo that, I could press Ctrl Z, much like in basically any program ever. This is the same key for undo. For redo is Ctrl Y. That's just by default. You can change that obviously in the preferences. You can also adjust these little handles at the either side of each key. So say I wanted to grab this, I can make adjustments to how that's animating by moving it like this kind of thing. If I set it, let go here, it's going to look kind of weird probably, yes. By default, it's going to be set to the auto setting, which gives you kind of like a slow in and slow out between each key. You can see here, it starts slow, it speeds up, and then it slows out. You can adjust the way that it animates in between the two keys though. So I'm going to grab everything, not just the rotate X anymore. I'm going to grab all of these. I'll just shift click to select everything at once. Or if I wanted, I could, click away and then click back on, and now everything is there again. There's a lot of information here, which you can see at the top of your graph editor. Some people do use these. I would say the most important ones to keep note of are these buttons in this area. This is going to be adjusting the different types of animation between your keys. There's usually really only two that I tend to use though. One is going to be stepped, like this, step tangents. So I use stepped and also auto tangents. If I grab my two keys here and I set them to stepped, that's basically going to turn off the animation in between the two keys. The program is not going to create any interpolation between the two keys. It's only doing it for what I have selected though, so you can see the root of the character is still animating, but the head is not anymore because it's set to stepped keys. So it's just, there's no information in between the key on frame 1 and frame 20, so once it gets to frame 20, it just snaps into position there. If I want that to create interpolation, once again, I would just set it to auto with this button here, and now it's got that smooth animation again. I switch back and forth in between these very frequently, because usually when you start off in animation, you'll be working pretty much exclusively in stepped curves, at least in the very beginning, because you don't really want it to be animating everything for you right away, because it's just going to make everything very messy. You want to just create some clean poses and be able to, flip in between them basically. So if I were to grab everything again, everything is selected, I could just go to stepped, and now it's set to stepped for everything. A hotkey that's very useful is the comma and the period on the keyboard. Those, if you press those, the period will move to the next key in the timeline, and the comma will move to the previous key, so you can use those to flip back and forth in between keys and compare them very quickly. I do that all the time. You can also change the tangents, the setting for them in just the keys without actually going into the graph editor. If you'd like, you can go to a key, if you right click it, go tangents, you have your options here. Once again, usually I just use stepped and auto. If you wanted, you could go to, say, spline and adjust the curves of your tangents manually, but personally, I only ever really use auto and stepped. So now let's just take a moment and try and create like an actual pose here. Take all this information that I've given you and put it into practice. So say on frame 1, maybe we want her to have more of an actual pose. I'm just going to start posing some things out. This isn't going to be a good pose, but just for the sake of showing you how things kind of work, putting all of these things I'm telling you into practice, something like this. So once again, I have auto key set to on, so anytime I move something, it's automatically keying that in the timeline for whatever control I have selected when I move it. Something like this kind of thing. Maybe I want her to be looking forward. Probably, you know what? She could probably close her mouth there. There we go. That's a bit less awkward. So say that's the pose that I want at frame 1. If I then go to my next key, we'll just do something a bit different here. We can lift this up. One thing that I just realized that would be a very important concept to point out here regarding Maya is the concept of inverse kinematics and forward kinematics, or IK and FK. Those are terms which you'll hear people referring to all the time when animating in 3D is IK and FK. Basically, that's going to refer to how any given part of your character will work in conjunction with the related pieces to it. So say, for example, this foot right here, you can see when I move the foot, if I drag it, if I move the foot here up, the leg is moving with the foot. That's because this is set to IK, so the foot is what's driving the things that are connected to it, being the leg. The foot is the driver for all of that information in this IK chain. However, say something like the arm, it doesn't work like that right now because that is set to FK. So if I grab the hand, if I move it, it's just doing some weird stretchy stuff here because this is set to FK, or forward kinematics, which means it's moving forward in the chain. So if I want that to move, I would need to, say, grab the shoulder and move that, then grab the elbow and move that, and then grab the wrist and move that. Most rigs will be able to change between IK and FK for things like the hands and feet, or even the head. Usually there is a control somewhere on the character to adjust that. You just need to find where it is. I believe on this rig it might be in this control right here. Yes. So if I click on this control, then I look over at my channel box, you can see there is a channel for IK FK switching. Right now it's set to 10. I can adjust that value. Usually things are broken up into numeric values in Maya. So a lot of the time you'll see something like 1 represents on and 0 represents off. So if I set this to 0, what I've done is turned off the FK arm, and now I can work in IK. You can see I have a different control here. This is the IK control for the hand, and now I can move the arm around like I did with the leg. Now the hand is driving the rest of the arm. And you can actually key those on and off switches, which can get confusing sometimes, doing switches between IK and FK. There are many different ways to handle the switch between IK and FK, because if you don't do it properly, you're going to end up with a visual pop in the animation when the switch happens. One popular way to do it is to just have it the switch happen over just one frame, or you could even animate between the values. But that's getting into a bit more advanced stuff, but you should at least be aware of the concept. So if I want to switch that back to FK, I'll just switch this to 10. It looks like 10 is the number for this character rather than 1. That's just how this character is being rigged. Now I have my FK arm back. So move this arm, I don't know, something like this. So now if I click and scrub in the timeline, it's not actually animating. That's because those keys are set to stepped. I want them to be set to auto. So one thing that's quite important to know actually is how to select multiple keys in the timeline at once. The way you do that is by you click somewhere and then you hold shift, and if you hold shift and drag with the left mouse button, you can select multiple keys in your timeline. So I have these 2 selected. I'll right click tangents auto, and now it's going to be auto tangents. You can see in between that information, which means it's going to interpolate between the 2 poses, and now it's moving. You can also move multiple keys at once. So if I shift click and drag to select these, I can use this this button kind of here in the middle. If I click and drag that with the left mouse button, I can move where these are on the timeline. I haven't actually played the animation yet. I've just been scrubbing in the timeline. So if I were to just play this, I could click play and you can see it is actually playing there. I'm just going to shrink the timeline down to, say, I don't know, like 30 frames now. By default, it's set to loop the playback. You can change that with this button here. You can turn on and off looping. Right now it's set to play once. That's basically how you animate things in Maya. I mean, there's a lot more that we could get into, but with that information, you could start animating. One very important concept about Maya I'd like to point out, though, is how to actually get something out of Maya and get to like a video file or something like that. Because say you've created some nice animation here and you want to basically get that out of Maya, you know, get a file that you can show someone with what you've done. This is something that I remember when I was in school was a concept that a lot of people didn't quite understand to begin with, because they would have come from, you know, working in things like Photoshop and other kinds of software where the concept of rendering doesn't really exist so much. It's just like, you know, file save as or file export and you've got your file. You can go, you know, file save scene and things like that in Maya, that's how you save your Maya scene, your working file here. But if you were go to, say, like export all or export selection, that's not how you would get a video file in order to be able to show someone your animation. The quick and dirty way to do that is by creating what's called a Playblast. Usually the way people do that is go right click in your timeline. You see Playblast right here. Anytime you see this little box here next to an option, this is the options box. So if I click this, it will just execute the command. But if I click this box before executing the command, it's going to open up an options box, allowing me to adjust the options before I want to Playblast. So there's a bunch of options available. These all kind of depend on your specific project and what you want to do, but basically we're looking at the file format, the encoding, you can change the quality, the size, the resolution, things like that, and also the destination folder for where your file is going to end up once you finish your Playblast. And a Playblast is just going to be a video file, basically showing your animation playing. I'm just going to set the destination folder for where I want the Playblast to be. I'll give it a name, Playblast, save, and then if I am to Playblast it, it's usually pretty quick. You can see it just played my animation there. And then once it's finished, it should open up a video file here. Mine is just set to default open in VLC media player. But we can then watch our Playblast. That's our animation right there. One thing of note is that when you make a Playblast, it's just going to Playblast for whichever viewport you currently have selected. So you see right now there is a very thin gray line around this one. If I click into this one, the gray line goes there. So that just shows you which is the current active viewport. So if I have this one active and I go Playblast, it's going to Playblast from this viewport. So Playblast is how you would get a quick video of your animation to show someone. If you want to get a more polished thing, then you would want to render a video. But rendering is kind of an entire job and skill set on its own. As an animator, you don't actually have to know how to render things, especially in a studio. There's going to be someone else whose job it is to make a render look nice. But if you're working on your own or your own project, then you probably do need to know about rendering. There is a rendering tab here with lots of different options. There's also, if I go into Windows, Rendering Editors, Render Settings, there are many settings that we can adjust to make a render, which can be good to know, but in terms of just speaking for basic animation, you don't really need to know much about the render settings. To be honest, as an animator, you don't actually need to know anything about render settings, because many times when looking at demo reels, at very good demo reels that people will use to get jobs at places like Pixar, Disney, DreamWorks, those kinds of places, a Playblast works just fine. If you submit a Playblast in your demo reel and it looks good, that's fine. It doesn't have to be a fancy render. Because specifically speaking to the job as an animator, what the animation directors and the hiring staff are going to be looking for is, can you animate something? Not can you render something. They just want to see how does your character move. And a Playblast shows that. It works just fine for showing that. That's getting off onto a bit of a tangent. So basically, if you want something quick, you'll use a Playblast to get a video file of what you've animated. If you want to get something a bit fancier looking, you'll get into render settings. But those are the two ways to get basically an output from Maya. One other thing I could show you quickly, actually, that can be quite useful and that you would need to know is how to create a camera, because I've talked about having a camera view. However, there is no actual camera in this scene right now. I'm just going to switch back to animation here. So if you want to create a camera, it's very, very easy. You just go to create here, cameras, create a camera. Now I have a camera here. It's very small, as you can see. This is my camera. I can make it bigger if I just scale it up. I just press R to get the scale option. Now I'm scaling this up and just left click and dragging. Whenever I'm scaling, if I click in the very middle here, this kind of yellow box, that'll scale it for the X, Y, and Z properties all at once. If I want to scale it in just one at a time, so for this one, this green one would be Y. That scales into just Y, but usually you just want to scale all three at once. So I've created a camera now. You can see it here. This is my perspective view. So what if I want to look through my camera? What I could do is grab, say, this other viewport, I could go panels, perspective, and now that there is a camera in my scene, there's an option here to choose for camera 1, which is just the default name of the camera that I made. I could rename it if I want. So if I go perspective camera 1, now this is going to be looking through this camera right here. So if I move the camera, I actually can't click on it right now. The reason for that, and this is something that you might run into, this is good to point this out right now, is that I can't actually click on it. That's because of these settings, which I chose up here. The option to select cameras is not selected right now, so first I need to turn that on. That would be this one right here. And now I can click on my camera. So if I move my camera, you can see my camera view updates automatically with it. So now I have a camera view which I could be looking through. I can rotate it and things like that. So say I want my camera view to be something, I don't know, something like that. There's a camera view. And now, assuming that camera view is the one that I want, I could start animating to the camera. You can have multiple cameras. You can have so many cameras in a scene. Usually, especially in a production, someone else is going to set up your cameras for you. That will be a different department than animation. But if you're making your own thing, you will need to set up your own cameras. One other thing that's useful that I could point out actually is an option here at the top of your viewport. There's a menu here for show. If I go down to viewport, there are going to be a lot of different options here. Right now, everything is checked. That means it is showing everything in this viewport. Say I wanted to hide something though. Say I don't want to be able to see this camera. I can find that there is an option for cameras right here. If I click that, now my camera does not show up anymore. This is actually something that I do adjust pretty frequently, is what is showing in the viewport. Usually what I will do is just go viewport presets none, just start off with showing nothing and the viewport, so everything is selected off, and then I'll just turn on the few things which I do want to see. So usually it would be like the NURBS curves, which will show me my controls. I also want to see polygons so I can see the character mesh. Maybe I want to see the cameras, so I could turn that back on, and cameras, so there we go. So if you can't see something which you're trying to find, one thing to look for would just go to the show option viewport and make sure that it's actually checked on in viewport. That a lot of the time, that's what I run into. I'll be working and be like, hey, where did this thing go? I can't find it. Then I just be like, oh, it's actually turned off. That's why I can't see it. Alright, so now that we've gone over those concepts, that's more or less all that you really need to know in order to get started animating in Maya. Obviously, there can be a lot more to it, but it is more or less just building on those same concepts. And for a lot of these concepts, I could probably make an entire video just about each one of them, so if there's something in particular that you'd like to know more about, definitely leave a comment below and I'd be happy to read it. Also, if you'd like to talk more about Maya or about animation in general, I definitely recommend joining my Discord server, which I have linked in the video description below. There you can ask any questions you want, and also even share your work for me and others to see. But I hope this video is useful for you though. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. And otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.